In Warhammer 40k, there are these things called the Titans, the God Machines, literally the biggest things on 2 feet. They carry weapons that are usually reserved for spacefaring battleships. They look so epic when walking forward out of a sunset with each earth-shattering footstep. And absolutely nobody plays them. You might say you play Titans, but you don't. No one actually does run Titans as an army. Maybe, and I mean maybe, you play with them if you have some kind of psychotic grudge against your own money and free time. But for most of us only moderately insane 40k players, these guys are a bridge too far. Starring Sean Connery. Because they are massively expensive, made of inferior materials, and most fun of all, weapons sold separately. If you say you run Titans, you need to stop lying because you're not good at it. Still, there's a certain grand appeal to these massive engines of war, leviathans of the battlefield, true god machines of warfare. So they maintain a certain level of attraction in spite of everything that surrounds them, somehow being both overpowered and underpowered at the same time. But what if you could play them without actually playing them? Put another way, what if every faction had their own Titan? Well, that's why I'm here. Over the next however many minutes we spend together, think of me as a car salesman showing you around the lot. Only the vehicles on this lot rival skyscrapers for height, dwarf Olympic swimming pools for volume, and individually carry enough ordnance to create a second Panama Canal. If that doesn't spike your interest, nothing will. So let's begin the tour, shall we? Beginning as is tradition with the Emperor's Angels of Death, the biggest thing the Space Marines have on offer is a hovering super tank known as the Astreus. If the Mechanicus were ever able to shrink down the technology needed to run a battle barge, this is what it might look like. With enough guns to answer everything from a horde to another Leviathan, the thing makes a statement by its sheer presence. Very fitting of something belonging to the Astartes. Honestly, from the time humanity relearned how to make anti-gravity stuff, it was only a matter of time until someone, Belisarius Cawl, figured out how to make it as huge as it could possibly be, before the thing would absolutely buckle under its own weight. And the Astreus, with its Halo Scorpion design, was the answer. Honestly, this thing really isn't that cool, unless you really like hover tanks. For one, it's made by Forge World, and even us financially abused 40k players must have standards. For two, it's only as durable as the old biggest thing in Space Marines, the Land Raider. And for its price, I'd honestly just take 2 Land Raiders. But as I said, if hover tanks are your jam, then here is your battle fortress, G.I. Joe. Don't scratch the paint. Now, what's the opposite of a knockoff? An upstager? A usurper? Well, whatever we want to call it, the Astreus is only a newborn to the lineage of super heavy tanks started by the Baneblade. Because of course the Imperial Guard, the army of tanks, would have one tank that's just really, really big. You see, what happened is that way back when, some Mechanicus explorer found the plans for the old P-1000 Rat, thought, yeah, that's a good design, and then made the dream into a reality. Now the Astra Militarum has this literal fortress on treads to roll out whenever they want to make a God Emperor damned point. Because whether it's deploying millions of troops to their deaths, or rolling out a World War I nightmare come to life, the army of mankind does not deal in subtlety. And much like the Leman Russ tanks come in several flavors, so do the Baneblades. I actually like to think of each Baneblade as a final evolution of the various Russes, with the Rogel Dorn functioning as the missing link. So, among others, you've got, of course, the basic version, a personal favorite of mine in the Hellhammer, a god killer called the Shadow Sword, and everyone's much beloved Stormlord, which, with 5 twin heavy bolters, 4 las cannons, 1 twin-linked Gatling cannon, and 2 more heavy stubbers in the back, just for luck, this is about as close to enough DACA as you will ever get. Unfortunately, the main and obvious drawback of the Baneblade series is their size. The things are nearly as wide as they are long, so navigating them through any sort of terrain is a bitch and a half. Every time I would struggle to squeeze one of these things through a terrain feature, I would flash on that old video of a Char 2C plowing through a stone wall. Thankfully now, there's a stratagem for that. But we've had enough big tanks to this point. Let's flash over to the Sororitas, where their biggest boy is nothing. Yes, sadly the biggest thing the Sisters of Battle have in their army is the Predator series of tanks which they stole from the Space Marines. Which, just between you and me, isn't a very good tank. At least not anymore. People like to tear apart the Leman Russ as an easy target of bad tank design, but don't gloss over this. Looks like someone tried to bully the Bradley IFV into becoming an MBT, and whoever did that was a DMF. However, the Mechanicus must have some big boys in their ranks. You'd think that, but sadly you'd be wrong. Officially, the Mechanicus have no big boys in their ranks, because the big boys they tinker around with all the time, the Titans and the Knights, are their own armies. So in lore they work very closely with the Titanic Walkers, and there are still rules allowing the mechs to join their ranks as a supplement, but we're only on tour to look at the big things in the official line, and to our disappointment, the Mechanicus don't have anything which could carve their initials into the moon and have it be visible on Earth. Still, they have the Castellan robots, which are still pretty cool big ol' robot walkers, so give them some points for that. Now for the Custodes. And I've told people about dreadnoughts before, but what I haven't told you is just how massive a concept they could become. And so let me introduce you to the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. The Custodes like everything bigger, even their dead guys. And if this thing got any larger, it could qualify as an Imperial Knight. Actually, it's almost on par with an Armiger class, so maybe it is. True, the Custodes Calidus Grav tank is a bit bigger and a bit tougher, and while I don't want to take anything away from big wonderful tanks, when I say big boy, you do want it to have legs and arms for stomping and punching respectively. Also, more importantly, we already talked about a hover tank in the Astraeus, so we've already been there, done that. Whereas the concept of a large destructive mech is an evergreen concept. Better still if it's being controlled by a corpse. And the Grey Knights are still fighting off the urge to join the Imperial Agents halfway house, like the Death Watch before them. So in the time before that happens, what have they got? Well, they have the Dread Knight, which, to their credit, isn't really bad, kinda big, kinda stompy, but it isn't really good either. At some point, someone needs to sit down and talk with the Grey Knights about the miracle of enclosed cockpits. Then they could be onto something. Something which hopefully won't crumble against the first tank it encounters. Oh yeah, and speaking of, the Imperial Agents. They exist. That is all. However, if I want to finish up the Imperium, I should just stop beating around the bush and talk about the Imperial Knights. Generally, there are 4 varieties of Knights. The Armiger class is the most numerous. The Quaestorus class is probably the first type you thought of when I mentioned the Knights, but we're only going to talk about the 2 biggest. The first and more canonical of the two is the Dominus class. I speak no hyperbole when I say that this thing packs more destructive potential than a nuclear bomb. And it might even be durable enough to survive a nuclear bomb. If you scaled back a Titan to, feasible sizes, this is what you would get. And it comes in two sub-flavors. The Castellan, for when you want to kill your enemies from far away with the superheated plasma cannon and the directed hatred of a volcano, or the Valiant, for when you want to kill your enemies very close with a massive harpoon and the largest flamethrower in the known universe. The other biggest ones are the Cerastus class. Not as durable as the Dominus, and have more varieties like the Quaestorus, but these mechs manage to be taller than both. So they make up points being bigger in that regard, and packing more freaky weapons. Unfortunately, they don't get much attention as they were more of a Horus Heresy thing, and are less prevalent than the other three. But I will continue to fight to make them part of the official lineup, because I like them. I like their design, and I like the Lancer in particular. I just think they're neat. Now, let's betray the Imperium and head over to Chaos, where there are no shortage of big things. Every god will of course put forward their greater demon of choice. Khorne has his Bloodthirster, Slaanesh has her Keeper of Secrets, Tzeentch has its Lord of Change, and of course there is a lot to love in Nurgle's own Great Unclean One. However, no Chaos player would ever forgive me if I didn't mention the Lord of Skulls. The centaur version of a mech and a tank. The thing is the largest demon engine to ever exist. Now, for those of you unaware what a demon engine is, I'll give you the 10-second explanation. A demon engine is what you get when your most tech-savvy and spiteful Space Marine Legion decides to join Chaos. They produce massive war constructs that by all means shouldn't be able to work, but with the handy and forced possession of an actual demon, they are brought to life. And the Lord of Skulls is what happens when you take that to its most overblown, 40k appropriate conclusion. 1,000 tons of boiling hatred and destruction, driven and partially controlled by one of Khorne's biggest and baddest troops. Their left hand is a Gatling gun, their right hand is an axe, their legs are treads, their dick is a cannon, their ass is an engine. Blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne, milk for the cornflakes, and if you run, you're only gonna die tired. Also, believe it or not, that's Chaos's only big boy. There are of course the Chaos Knights, but they're functionally identical to the normal Knights, just meaner. And of course there are the Traitor Titan Legions, but we don't talk about those in interest of preserving our bank accounts. So let's see what the aliens have to offer. The Aeldari have a pretty direct comparison to the Imperial Knights in their Wraith Knights. It's genuinely 1-to-1, but I do briefly have to explain the concept of Eldar Wraith constructs, which is good, since they're the best part of that army. You see, when an Eldar dies, their souls get put into a Spirit Stone, so they can avoid being tortured by Slaanesh for the rest of time. Those stones get put into a Craftworld vault for protection and production. But sometimes they can be pulled out of storage to power these constructs. More powerful or intact souls get put into bigger constructs called Wraith Lords. But what's different about a Wraith Knight is that it requires 2 minds. So it's very much like a Pacific Rim Jaeger, except that one of the pilots is dead. And again, identical to the Throne Mechanicum in the Imperial Knights, which stores the mind of every pilot who's ever controlled that specific mech. The difference for the Aeldari being that they can swap out the souls, and, of course being Eldar, their version is much more skinny than a bulky Imperial Knight. Now, Drukhari always follow after their paler cousins. You wouldn't think them to have anything that big with them being fast and delicate, and their range being f***ing tiny, but they do have something. It's the Tantalus. Not all that interesting if I'm being completely honest. It's more or less just a roided up version of their standard vehicle, the Raider/Ravager. It's a bigger space boat, but there's nothing really wrong with that. Fair enough, Dark Eldar. The kin from Leagues of Votann are just the same way. Small guys, small range, you wouldn't think they'd have anything massive, but they do. The Hecaton Land Fortress. And I'll tell you, there's something about the term land fortress that hits the ear just right. It's like Dreadnought or Leviathan of War. Really hits that feeling of power, which this thing has in plenty. Guns in the front, guns in the back, guns on the left, guns on the right. And still enough space to carry troops. It almost rivals the Stormlord. Almost. Anyone remember that film Wild Wild West with Will Smith? Stick with me here. You remember how the main villain made his space in a big mechanical spider? Well, the Necrons looked at that concept and said, what if we made it not steampunk and also not stupid? And then they made the Serapatech Heavy Construct. Despite its truly awesome presence, this thing is pretty dumb. It's a Canoptic after all, which for those of you that don't speak Necron, are basically their autonomous servants. Robots for the robots. Between this and the Catan shards, Necrons have a habit of making their world-ending weapons pretty stupid, which is probably a good idea. With forelimbs capable of pulling open tanks like bags of chips, and guns that could sculpt a whole new Mount Rushmore by accident, best for everyone that this thing doesn't get ideas of its own. Reaching the faction that is all about being big and excessive, the Orcs have many options for large and in-charge war engines. For more Imperial Knight types, there are the Gorkanaut and the Morkanaut, of course named for the two Orc gods. The Gork is big and punchy, and burns through more ammo in 2 minutes than both of our world wars combined. And the Mork is very shooty, and will in all likelihood destroy itself with its own massive unstable guns. Then there are the Gargants, Orc Titans basically, wide as they are tall, very impressive, in artwork anyway. We haven't seen a new model of these things in some time, and likely still won't for a while, if ever. But let's meet in the middle with the Stampa. If you can't figure out what this Stampa is from its look and its name, I would assume that's because you're Helen Keller. It's big, it's tough, it stomps. Not even with its feet. Even at low power, that chainsaw could uproot a pillbox, and that cannon will send even the tanks scurrying for cover. Just thank the God Emperor they'll never be able to aim the damn thing. Remember folks, the best way to avoid Orc fire is to make yourself obscure and wait until they get bored and start shooting an easier target. The same could not be said for the Tau, who never went to the gym because they were too busy at the range. Though like the Orcs, they also have a good selection of titanic killing machines. The smallest of their big boys is also the OG, that being the Riptide. A very impressive walker that unfortunately doesn't quite hold the same prowess it enjoyed back in the day. But if you were there, you remember it by a different and well-earned nickname. Then of course there is the Storm Surge. The Tau found a way to flip a Baneblade vertical and mount some legs in place of treads. Though not quite as tough as other super heavy walkers, As the model might suggest, it possesses enough ranged firepower to make the shooting phase last 10 years. You would think it's an orc model with that amount of guns, but the difference here is that this thing might actually hit you. But anyone that knows anything about the Tau won't let me escape this faction without touching on the real big boy of the army, the Tau Manta. Now, I'm assuming that most of you watching this are now detecting a faint scent of smoke upon looking at this thing. And that's because your wallet has just burst into flames at the sight of this, no joke, $1,400 monstrosity. It was a common saying back when you could still buy one of these, that if you owned one, you had too much money. And that is absolutely correct. The only thing in the game more expensive than this is a Warlord class Titan, which... No. Don't do that. Practice some self-love. Then there are the Gene Stealers, who we don't care about because they have nothing, and they're only a distraction from the true grand finale. It is the Tyranids, and of course there could be no other. None besides the big one. The inspiration for Helldivers Bio-Titan, as seen in Space Marine 2, it is the one, the only Hierophant. Peace was never an option, surrender your biomass. With enough ranged weapons to send an entire Space Marine chapter to the history books, powerful enough limbs to destroy a Lehman Russ tank by accident, and more health than everything else on this list, I'm not joking, this is the end-all be-all. Fall down to your knees and pray because this is your god now. If anyone needs proof why the Tyranids are probably going to win in the end, here is the only proof you need in that argument. I am only uncomfortable around one 40k miniature, this is it, and I have no shame admitting to that. Casual research tells me that a Hierophant is a religious figure that brings people to divinity, and that seems about right. Because when you see this thing, one way or another, you're gonna meet God. Imperial Knights may still be my favorite, but I can still respect the other guys who do it just as good. Moral of the story, there are giants out there, folks. So be afraid. Be very afraid. And sweet dreams, everyone. Most famous for beating up its smaller Chaos brother, and killing a Helldrake by throwing a stone pillar at it. Very powerful, very cool, so how do we get more of these things? Well, the very first step in making a Dreadnought is to die. No, I'm being completely serious.